Welcome back to PechPong. Today we're going to be doing a blocking tutorial from A to Z. We're going to be starting with basic fundamentals, things like grip, wrist angle, arm structure, the theory of adding spin, taking away spin, and neutral spin. Then we'll be moving into advanced fundamentals, things like punch blocking, blocking against dead balls from pips players, how to block against heavy sidespin loops from a left-handed player as well as a right-handed player. Then we'll be moving into the next section, which is winning sequences. So how to kind of structure a point to win, and what are some of the pitfalls that a lot of people fall into when blocking that end up losing the point. Then we'll be talking about how to practice those skills that we've talked about in the whole video, and basic drills that you can use to kind of structure practices to improve your block. So without further ado, let's get started with the first portion of the video, which is basic fundamentals. Alright, so the first fundamental I think that's super important when blocking is that it's very important to do nothing. And a lot of times when I start teaching someone how to block, they start by doing a lot of stuff with their hands, and they try to move to the ball. And the very first thing that I usually do is I have them kind of blindfold, and I put their hand in the right position, and I just hit balls right to their racket. And if you have the right angle and the right height, the ball will go over the net when someone loops. And that's basically what you're doing when you're blocking, is that you're just using the opponent's energy to get the ball over the net. So that's kind of where I like to start. And then once you get comfortable doing nothing, then you can start adding a little bit on the ball, a little bit of pressure. You really want to feel like you're just a wall and just a giant board, and you're kind of moving very steady through the ball and not kind of changing your angle very quickly. So this leads me into the next kind of theory, which is adding, subtracting, and staying neutral. And I think this is important to know because when you're blocking, you're pretty much trying to stay pretty neutral. And you're not trying to add spin to the ball, and you're not trying to subtract spin from the ball. And a lot of times, like I said, people either go one of two directions. They kind of add spin, or they try to take away spin to have control. And in reality, you just want to be very steady, very neutral through the ball, and let the ball kind of do the work. So this leads me into the next portion, which is what happens when doing a neutral block is not enough, and your opponent is making a very heavy spinny loop, and the ball just keeps going out and really high. Well, we should learn how to, first of all, wait for the ball to come to us, and then be able to kind of push down and put pressure down on the ball in order to keep it lower. And a good way I like to do this is I actually have my opponent try and hit the ball on their own side of the table. And it's important when you're trying to hit your own side of the table that you let the ball come to you and then you push down. A lot of times people also kind of move forward and they add spin and they push the ball on the table, and that's gonna just add spin. And whenever you're adding spin to a very spinny loop, you're gonna get a lot of loss of control. So let's go over the arm structure of the backhand block. And a lot of times I see people that kind of get their arm out like this, and they're kind of poking at the ball. And they're also kind of giving me the stop sign effect here with their hand. And that's going to be okay, you're going to be able to block like that. But in a game, it's not very effective because if you're blocking like this, it's very hard to transition into an attack. Whereas if you're blocking in your normal backhand posture, arm posture, then you're able to seamlessly change between attack and block. Which is a very important skill when you're trying to be offensive in matches. So the next part is the wrist posture. And for many years I had a very bent wrist, and this led to a lot of pain when I was practicing for many hours because it kind of would lock up and it'd start to hurt. So it's not more effective to bend your wrist more. So I would say just have it slightly bent and try to keep it pretty neutral. Not too neutral because then you won't be able to block, but just slightly bent is a good place to start, and you won't have wrist pain down the road, and it's just as good as having a very bent wrist. The next fundamental is keeping the racket in front when you're blocking, and there's two main reasons for this. The first one is because if you're keeping the racket in front, the transition is very quick between forehand and backhand. If you're catching it on the side of your body, the transition between your forehand block and backhand block is very large. And the second reason that you should be keeping in front is that you're also able to see it with your eyes, and you're going to be making a lot better strikes on the ball because you're able to see the ball come in and hit the racket. Now, I will say that when you have it more in front, it is harder to go down the line with your block, so your wrist position will have to really be more drastic on the forehand and the backhand. So that's something to consider. But I still think it's worth it to keep it more in front because of the first two things that I said. As far as ball timing goes, I like to catch it a little bit on the rise or top of the bounce because then you're able to be pretty aggressive and use their speed very efficiently. I will say that if you catch it very early, it's very hard to transition between attacking and blocking. So typically I prefer to be catching it at more of the top of the bounce because then I can easily see if I want to attack it or I want to block it during a point. And the first advanced fundamental we're going to be talking about is the backhand punch block. This is a really fun shot that I've incorporated in my game, and I think everyone should have it as well. So the first thing that I want to cover is that I think it's important to have a relaxed wrist, and when you're hitting the shot, you don't want to be taking too big of a wrist movement because then the opening and closing of the racket becomes very drastic. So just a little bit of back and forth with the wrist is ideal. And the second thing that's important is to not take too big of a backswing. So you're having a very small wrist movement and a very not too big of a backswing. So a fun way I like to have people get a feeling for what they're trying to do with a punch block is I get a piece of paper and I put it in front of them. And the goal is to not take too big of a backswing or too big of a wrist, and to get a nice smack on the paper and get it to really pop. When you're punch blocking, you want to be trying to use a neutral spin. So you're not trying to add too much spin, and you're not trying to kind of go underneath the ball. And I like to feel that I'm slightly ascending through the shot to get like a very small amount of top spin, very small, because you're trying to be very more smacky with it. And I like to catch the ball at the top of the bounce, ideally, because this is the best angle to get over the net. If you're catching it early, you're probably not going to make it over the net, and if you're catching it late, it's also very hard to be aggressive with this shot. So two situations that I really like to use the backhand punch block is when my opponent makes an opening loop to my backhand. I like to be aggressive and punch block it and use their spin. And the second one is when they put the ball a little bit higher to me. Sometimes it can be very tricky to try and loop a ball that's higher to your backhand, and it can be very surprising when they put the ball up there, and you might not have enough time to turn around and use a forehand. So in this case, I like to get my hand nice and high, and then I like to just kind of punch it from that high position because it's hard to, get above the ball with the backhand. So the next advanced fundamental is going to be blocking high balls. And I know I just talked about punching high balls, but sometimes in a game you really just want to try and block it for strategic reasons. And for this one, it's really important that you catch the ball early. As soon as the ball comes up to a higher point, it becomes very hard to block the ball. So for this one, you're probably going to usually be too far outside of the table, so you probably need to get in and take a nice step in. So I have a drill here where I'm kind of moving back and forth, and I'm kind of trying to get early in and block it right off the bounce. So the next advanced fundamental is going to be the really wide blocks to the backhand and the kind of inside block to the backhand. Because not always are we going to be able to move in position for the block perfectly. So sometimes we're going to have to reach across our body really far over to the backhand side. And what you want to do is you really want to try and cup the wrist and get over as far as you can with your arm. And this way you can kind of bring the ball back in. If you were to just kind of move over like this, the ball, you may be able to get it on, but the ball will probably have a pretty bad placement right back to the center of the table. So kind of moving your hand and cupping the wrist like this will help you to bring the ball back in nice and wide so the opponent has a hard time making another forehand. And the next one is when it comes in too far to your right side and you get kind of stuck in between taking a forehand and a backhand. And when this happens, you kind of want to move the whole structure of your arm over to the right and then really bend your wrist to get a nice open angle Otherwise, it's probably going to go off the side of the table. And this one also lends itself to almost a strategic option. And sometimes you can get on the inside of the ball and make it go really wide. And it can have a little bit of tailspin going super wide, and the opponent may have a hard time getting to that ball as well. You can see most of the time I talk about defense as more of a backhand thing, because typically in a match, if someone's hitting to your forehand, unless they really surprise you, I think it's really good to open and make a good counter loop or a loop against those balls. So typically when someone is attacking in a game, they try to target your backhand, just because it's easier to make a counter loop with the forehand. So the next advanced fundamental is when a right-handed player or a left-handed player makes a really big hook spin with their forehand. And this happens sometimes when you get them out wide. It's kind of like a defense mechanism so that you can't get them to the other corner. And what you need to do for, let's say, the right-handed player is, if the ball starts coming in really wide, you need to learn to have an open wrist, and it really might feel uncomfortable. But if you can get your hand to be like this, a little bit more open, and then you're going to be able to block back down the line to their backhand. The one thing that they want you to do is have a normal neutral grip, and their spin will bring the ball right back to them, and they get to take another forehand. So learning to have that kind of cupped wrist, open wrist, will help you to get the ball down the line. Another strategy when a right-handed player loops to your wide forehand is if you run over with your backhand and try to kind of go against the spin. This is another really great way of getting the ball to go the other direction.
Three. We have a 2-1 lead for Su Hui.
So for a left-handed player, when they do that hook spin, it's a really big strategy of left-handed players when they loop to you to do a lefty hook into your backhand, because the backhand is very uncomfortable because of the reach, and most likely this cupped thing that I talked about earlier to get the ball is not what you want, because their spin is going directly back to them, and they would get to take another forehand and another forehand and another forehand. So what we really don't want is for the ball to go back that way. So what I usually do is I kind of go with the spin. And this helps for two reasons. The first one is because it has less effect on the ball. The ball has less effect on the rubber, and I'm able to get it down the line. And the second reason is that it's a lot easier to catch the ball because it's moving very aggressively to my left. And a lot of times if I just try to block it, I would just miss the ball. So this way it lets me track down the ball and make a good block down the line. Additionally, you can run over with your forehand and kind of try and chop block it a little bit, but this is a little more advanced, and yeah, depends if you want to try and use it. I have used it in the past because maybe I'm trying to look for a forehand and I find out it's too wide, and I end up just kind of chop blocking it. And again, that left-handed player is going to have a very hard time because it's going to their backhand after they just hit a forehand. So the ability to block against a dead ball. This is kind of a skill that I've picked up, and it's very, very useful against short pips players and players who hit very flat. And if you just try to normal block against players who have short pips, the ball will go straight down into the table. And it can be very frustrating because it's very hard to get the ball over the net. And so what you can do is kind of open up the angle a little bit and then almost do a negative spin like we talked about earlier. And very, very gently do a negative spin with an open racket, and that'll send the ball nicely over the table. It can be hard when they're hitting pretty hard at you, but if you do a nice gentle movement, it can come in handy when they're hitting a flat ball. Alright, so now we're going to talk about winning sequences or good tactics during a match, how to make your block effective and win points with it. And the first one we're going to be covering is the block really wide to the backhand. And I think it's super common that players, they push, maybe they're trying to push short, or maybe they're trying to push to a certain location, and the ball kind of leaks out off the end of the table, and the opponent gets a forehand in. And a lot of times the player will go to your backhand, and if you make a subpar block, they're going to be taking another forehand because you're not able to get it to a good location. And you're going to probably end up losing the point. And what players, good blockers do, is they're able to really block wide to the backhand to avoid that second forehand. Honestly, this strategy works better when your opponent thinks that they have the upper hand during the point. Like I said, if you accidentally push long and they get that first attack, they're going to think that they have the opportunity to take 2 forehands. And if you can kind of quickly change gears and focus on making a really good block to that wide location, they're going to be really caught off guard, and you may be able to change the tide of the point. I've made a couple points here to demonstrate that if you are able to get the ball wide, they may be able to take another forehand, but it really leaves the table open for a nice block to the other corner. It also opens up a down the line block because of exactly what I said. Is a lot of players, they make a medium bad block to the backhand corner, and the player kind of is anticipating taking another forehand, and if you can make a good block down the line to the forehand, this is also usually an open area and can leave the opponent wide for an open block to the backhand. So the next sequence is when your opponent is trying to take forehand whole table and they play a forehand from their backhand corner. A good strategy is actually to go back to their backhand corner. It seems counterintuitive because they just took a forehand there, but in reality they have to feel like they're trying to cover the whole table. So they're going to be recovering back a little bit more to the middle, and if you block again to their backhand, they're going to get a little bit stuck. They're going to leave the table open for a block to the wide forehand the next ball. Another great tactic is if you play an opponent and they're trying to kind of move back and create space, maybe try to get more power in the shot, you can block shorter, or maybe you made a really good block wide and now they're out and a little bit further from the table. If you can learn to take off a little bit of energy, this is a really good defensive strategy because now the opponent has to come in and try to pick the ball up, which lets you maybe make a really strong counterattack on the next ball.
Smart play. Canuck slowing down the ball on his last 2 blocks.
And the last tactic that's super potent is to disrupt the spin a little bit, which maybe adding a little spin to a block will really make your opponent feel uncomfortable, because a lot of times we practice and the opponent's just blocking. As soon as someone adds a little spin to their block, the whole timing dynamic becomes very different, and making a strong shot off of a kick block versus a normal block is very difficult. Alright, so the last portion of this video is going to be how to practice and improve your block. And you can use any of the methods that I showed in this video to simulate practice. I think they're all really useful ones that I used, and I'm going to add a few more here. So to start off, I think it's really important to do like 50% of the table only and work on maybe a backhand block from 50%, just because mentally it's very simple to not have to worry about one side of the table or the forehand, and you can just block and practice moving around in the backhand block. And you can also then do that with the forehand block and practice moving around. And another important aspect is that if you can kind of move your feet while you're practicing this, your block is going to improve a lot. When you're moving your feet, you want to be on your toes, and you kind of want to move both feet simultaneously and create space for your block so that you can keep the structure of the stroke. The next one is going to be mixing between normal loops and spinny loops. And if you can master adjusting your angle very quickly, seeing what the opponent is giving you, whether it's a really spinny loop or a fast loop, and just kind of making the right angle, this is going to help a lot in games, because when you're watching your opponent, you have to identify what kind of loop they're making. And yeah, so this is a really good drill. You can just have someone give you multi-ball and just practice making the adjustments with your angle. And probably my favorite drill is just to have the opponent loop anywhere on the table. And typically I like to have my opponent or my partner kind of not loop full hard, because I'm not the best blocker in the world. So I tell them, you know, go like 65% loops and just loop anywhere. And I like to target all 3 spots on the table. So I'll block to the forehand, I'll block to the backhand sometimes, and then I'll also block to the middle. And just learning to block to those spots helps, because in a game you feel confident to block anywhere on the table. Additionally, you can have them start with an opening underspin loop, and this will help because, yeah, when someone opens with underspin, it typically has more spin, and learning to block that and then a topspin loop, it helps to create good transitioning between underspin loops and topspin loops. And to master wide movements, which is very important because sometimes you need to move a lot in order to block, I do a 2-2 drill, and basically the opponent just loops 2 balls to your backhand, 2 balls to your forehand, and you're focusing on making very wide movements and blocking. And the last one is to put it all together, and this one is also really effective because it simulates a real match. And what I do is I push long, they serve short, I push long, and their job is to open and play free point. And as soon as you push long, your opponent knows that you're pushing long, so they're going to be looping pretty strong. And your job is to probably make 1 or 2, 3 good blocks and then try to stay in the point, maybe transition into an offensive position if you make a couple good blocks, or stay in defensive position if you're a really defensive player, and try to win points that way. So this is another really good practice method. It's very simple in just pushing long and letting them open. Alright, so now there's a bonus tip in this video, and it's going to be a tip I got from a really high level player. He was once top 50 in the world. He was a penhold blocker from Brazil. His name is Kazu, and I was asking him about how to improve my block, and he said that it's very important to understand that what you give to the opponent will have a lot of effect on what you get back. So, for example, if you make a very fast no-spin push, you can pretty much expect that it's not going to be a very spinny loop coming back to you because the opponent doesn't need to put a lot of spin. And so you can already have your angle adjusted to that proper angle to block the ball. And if you give a medium-long heavy push, well, guess what? You're probably going to be getting a really heavy spin loop back, and you can anticipate a lot better what you're going to be doing with your blocks. So I thought that was a really good tip, very insightful, and has definitely improved my overall blocking skills. Alright, so that's the video. I hope you guys learned something from that. This video has been a lot of fun to make. I've been working with people, and I felt like it was time to make a good blocking video so that you can also improve your block. Alright, so I'll see you guys in the next video.
Bye, miss.